I was born in St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the Caribbean. I was born on the main island, which is St. Vincent, and I grew up um, between three countries. So I lived in the Caribbean. I moved with my grandparents in the countryside when I was young, and I left here when I was about 6 years old or 7 years old. And I moved to Canada, which was Montreal, Quebec, Montreal. And I spent several years there till I was probably about 9 years old or 10 years old, and I went back to the Caribbean and stayed with my grandmother for another couple of years until I was probably about, I don't know, maybe 13 years old, somewhere there, 12, 13 years old. Then I went back to Canada and lived with my mom for another year or so, and then I moved to Washington, D.C. in 1980. And I was in Washington, D.C. until pretty much today, around this area. I have brothers and sisters. I have an older sister, Joanne, who lives in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I have a younger sister, Chantal, who lives in Miami, Florida. And then my father has other children out there. One of my sisters, Carol, who still lives in the Caribbean. And I have a couple other sisters around and brothers from my father's second marriage. And so there's those siblings that are out there. But my life was mainly surrounded around my grandmother in St. Vincent, up in the Mesopotamia Valley, which is like in the countryside. It's like the Garden of Eden. Everything was there. We had everything. We were happy, we were free, and I learned a lot about life there with some of my siblings in the early part of my life, along with many of my other cousins and my aunt and other family members. I lived with my grandmother. She was alive and she took care of me. She thought I was the greatest thing, and she taught me a lot about business, how to do business with the lands, and about properties, how to get properties, build properties, rent them, how to diversify in different businesses, like having investments in things that came up, like we had a gas station that came in, so she invested in it. She had, as I said before, properties, different types of properties. She has agricultural lands. We planted bananas, and we had spices like nutmeg trees, many nutmeg trees, and she had things where she planted products that you could ship overseas, whether it be coconut or whether it be sweet potato that the lands planted. She had a lot of people working for her. So she taught me a lot of that while I was growing up, not even realizing that she was teaching me these things. I was the one who she sent to take care of many of these things. So I'm grateful for that. I had relatives around the Caribbean. When I got to Canada, there was many relatives there who had migrated from St. Vincent. And I had many relatives when I got to Washington, D.C. in 1980. So a lot of people were leaving the Caribbean. A lot of my relatives, by the time I was born and got to know myself, they had already left, and many of them lived in England, many of them lived in Trinidad and Tobago, many of them lived in the United States, and so that's how come that the younger ones of us kind of migrated out from the Caribbean into Canada and to the United States. But yes, we were around our relatives, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins especially. So that was pretty good. When I was a teenager, I was in Washington D.C. I was in high school in Washington D.C. I went to Woodrow Wilson High School, and teenage life was different than now. Um, my main thing was music. I love music, the '80s music. There was great music back then, not like today. You know, back then you had groups like the Culture Club and Wham and um, Air Supply and there's just a lot of great music back in the '80s. So I love that. I listen to it all the time. The Police, and then you have U2 came in, um, and you had I think it was the Secret Police, and you had a lot of people out of Canada, Brian Adams, because I was in Canada, um, and I enjoyed those music, and it was great, and I miss those times. I really do. So that was my thing in being a teenager in the '80s. Was music was the main thing that kept me going, kept me alive. And during the '80s, I think I started to learn to read many things about why am I here on this planet and what am I doing here on this planet, and all those questions started to come up. Teenagers today have no idea what they have. I believe they take everything for granted. They have cell phone and they have tablets and they have all these things at their fingertips, and I think that they don't even know how to use it properly. Back then we had no cell phones. We had more connection with people, which today the many of the teenagers don't have, I think. They just communicate through their phone or their tablet or the iPad or whatever they might have, and I think they're missing a human connection. And so I think that we are going in a direction that where we are going to get to a place where we don't even know how to communicate with each other. We don't know how to deal with each other. It will be like two machines talking to one another, and I think that is really bad. But that's the direction now. But growing up, it was more communication with people and dealing with people and dealing with your friends at school and the other people in your neighborhood. I can't say if it's better now or not. It's different. So you can't compare difference and see which one is better. I think that today I think they're probably more smarter because they have more access to knowledge at their fingertips. So they probably know more, which is normal. You would expect that knowledge increase with time. But better, I don't think so. I don't know how to give a comparison of such. Well, again, I mainly grew up with my grandmother, who taught me a lot of valuable lessons. Very smart lady, extremely intelligent, business-wise, people-wise. It's a woman who truly, one of the few people I've met in life who lived her life right, treated people right, took care of other people, cheering, and lived very closely to what she believed was her God. And she installed a lot of that in me. So I'm grateful for her, for that. As far as my parents are concerned, I don't think I've really ever been too close to both of them. My mom, who lives in Canada, and my dad, who lives here in Maryland. I don't think we ever had a connection like how I had a connection with Annalie, who was my grandmother. So that's pretty much it about that.
My life and my dad's life are actually very similar in some ways. We both like music. We both feel that music really just helps us go to our happy place, gets us through the day. And we both had mentors. My dad's my mentor. He had Annalie, who's basically teaching us how to get through this world. And some differences are that my dad grew up in a time where there was no cell phones, and they had more communication between humans, whereas today everyone talks through text and social media. My dad basically grew up without parents, and I am glad that I have both the mind to love me and support me in whatever I want to do, and how they are teaching me how to deal with this world to make my life much easier than when they grew up.